All right, folks, I'm going to continue on. So again, we're talking about game theory here, just kind of building up the theory, the approach, just your basic understanding of how these simple, simultaneous move, one-shot games work. So again, the players are making their moves at the same time, and they only play the game once. In a situation where there's only two players, and they each have two possible strategies, you can represent the game in this normal form representation of the game, which is just a table like we see here. Here's player one. These are their two strategies. Here's player two. These are their two strategies. And then where the strategies overlap is an outcome for the game. Player B plays left. Player A plays up. Player A gets 10 million. Player B gets 20 million. We saw how we can identify a dominant strategy by taking the perspective of a player and considering what they would do in response to the other player's actions. Player A, if player B played left, could play up or down. If it plays up, they get 10. If they play down, they get negative 10, so they would choose up. If player B played right, player B could play up and get 15 or play down and get 10. 15 is greater than 10, so they would choose up again. So regardless of what player B does, player A would choose up. That is the best possible strategy for them, regardless of what their opponent does. Thus, they have a dominant strategy to play up. Another type of strategy a player can engage in is called a secure strategy. In the case in which a player does not have a dominant strategy, one possibility would be a secure strategy, a strategy that guarantees the highest payoff given the worst possible scenario. So essentially, they think about what's the worst possible scenario for them, and they try to minimize that, like get the second best worst outcome, basically. So by using a secure strategy, a player maximizes the payoff that would result in the worst case scenario. To find a secure strategy, a player examines the worst payoff that could arise for each of his or her actions and chooses the action that has the highest of these worst payoffs. Quick demonstration problem to help you figure out how to identify a secure strategy. So in the game, we've been analyzing what is the secure strategy for player B. So we know player B does not have a dominant strategy. So then the question is, should player B play their secure strategy? Well, if they were to play their secure strategy, they would consider what they should do in response to player A choosing up. So if player A chooses up, the worst thing that could happen is for player B to choose right and get 8. So if they choose left, they get 20. If they choose right, they get 8. 8 would be the worst of those two. And then in response to player A choosing down, player B considers what's the worst possible outcome here. If they play left, they get 7. If they play right, they get 10. Well, 7 is worse than 10. So these are their two worst options. And so the best of the two worst options is to choose right, because right would get it a higher payoff than would left. So the secure strategy for player B would be to play right. All right, so again, these are ways of kind of working one's way through these scenarios where, again, decision-making is interdependent. And it's a way of sort of trying to create some certainty out of uncertainty. One is to identify a dominant strategy. In that case, you know you should play your dominant strategy. Another one is to say, well, I don't really know what to do. Well, let me just minimize the worst case scenario. You play the secure strategy. Secure strategies suffer from two shortcomings. One, it is a very conservative strategy and should be considered only if you have a good reason to be extremely adverse to risk. So again, if you are just really afraid of losing, then you should minimize the worst case scenario by playing your secure strategy. Also, another shortcoming of a secure strategy is that it does not take into account the optimal decisions of your rival and thus may prevent you from earning a significantly higher payoff. If you are not considering what your rival is going to do optimally, then you could wind up missing an opportunity to choose something better than what you would get if you chose your secure strategy, which is to play right. So player B could recognize that player A has a dominant strategy, and it's very clear from the payoffs that player A does have a dominant strategy. Again, in these simple cases and simple examples, everybody knows everybody's payoff, so nothing is hidden from anybody. So player B knows that player A has a dominant strategy to play up. Therefore, player B should consider what move she should make in response to player A playing up that would maximize her profit. In this case, obviously, left is better than right because 20 is greater than 8. So a natural way of formalizing the end result of such a thought process is captured in the definition of what is called the Nash equilibrium. A set of strategies constitutes a Nash equilibrium if, given the strategies of the other players, no player can improve her payoff by unilaterally changing her own strategy. So a Nash equilibrium in a game is a set of strategies where both players are doing the best they possibly can and neither player has any incentive to deviate from those sets of strategies. The Nash equilibrium is named for John Nash. John Nash was like this mathematician who, he was pretty brilliant. He worked at MIT. He earned the Nobel Prize for economics, and he was schizophrenic. So he was a bit crazy, and he was in the hospital for a while, but eventually he was able to get his head together, realize that the voices in his head were really just his own voices, and he was able to go back to MIT and teach for a while, but last year he died in a car accident. But he did change the approach of economic theory and modeling by discovering this concept of the Nash equilibrium. So what's useful about the Nash equilibrium is that it provides certainty where there is uncertainty. So you might have a situation where you have like players and they're involved in these type of games, and there's really no clear-cut result. Whereas in a market where there's a monopolist, there's a clear-cut result. The monopolist is going to set their marginal revenue equal to the marginal cost. They're going to set their output based on that, and they're going to set their price based on what demand is in the market. Like, it's a very clear-cut result. But when you have situations like this, things can go a variety of ways. The Nash equilibrium was a way for economists to be able to say, well, even though we don't know exactly how things are going to go, this is how things will likely go. So if you have one Nash equilibrium, that is the likely result from these interactions, these interdependent interactions. Games may have only one Nash equilibrium, or they might have multiple Nash equilibria, in which case at least you narrow down the possible likely outcomes. It's also possible for games not to have any Nash equilibria whatsoever. But again, just the concept itself of Nash equilibrium was able to allow economists and economic theory to actually make real-world predictions in situations where we otherwise would not have been able to. So prior to him developing this notion, we were not able to say, well, in these particular situations, we know what's going to likely happen. Like, we had no idea. We couldn't say anything about it. So it did change the nature of a lot of what is done. Game theory is also something that was used during the Cold War when the U.S. and Russia, were at odds. And there was just a lot of sort of uncertainty about like what could happen in that situation with respect to, nuclear weapons being, shot at each other and everybody kind of blowing the earth up. And, the Nash equilibrium was one of those sort of concepts that helped sort of to establish that like the best sort of result is to have like a certain amount of essentially the same amount of missiles pointed at each other, so that everybody understands that if a missile is launched, that all other missiles would be launched in retaliation and everybody would destroy each other, what was called mutually assured destruction, also known as MAD. So that was just sort of like the weird kind of Nash equilibrium of our Cold War era that kind of stopped us from destroying ourselves. Like, we knew that nobody had any incentive to deviate from that sort of set of strategies. Like, point missiles at each other, but don't shoot the missiles, It sounds very simple, but ultimately, because politics and everything else, geopolitical sort of interactions amongst a lot of players, like that could have gone wrong. And it could have been a really difficult situation to maneuver, but again, using game theory, people were able to kind of figure out, okay, this is what we should do, and it kind of helped us to get through that time. It's a thing that happened. Anyway, so Nash has a lot of importance. They made that movie about him, A Beautiful Mind. Russell Crowe won the Best Actor Academy Award for it. You might have seen it. Anyway, that's who John Nash is. If you're interested, check out that movie. It's interesting. Anyway, so that's like the history of the Nash equilibrium, and now we can use this basic sort of setup, this normal form of a game, to identify Nash equilibria if they exist, which again will tell us the likely outcome of these games. So in a Nash equilibrium, no player has any incentive to deviate from the Nash equilibrium strategies. So let's do a demonstration problem to try to identify the Nash equilibrium. So in the game we've been analyzing, the question is, what are the Nash equilibrium strategies for players A and B? All right, so in order to identify Nash equilibrium strategies, we need to take the perspective of each player and consider what they would do optimally in response to their opponents, what their opponents' moves might be. So the Nash equilibria will be the outcomes that both players would choose. So let's say player B would choose left if player A chose up. And then player A would choose up if player B chose left. Then this would wind up being a Nash equilibrium because both of them would choose that. And neither of them would have any incentive to deviate from those sets of strategies. So let's take the perspective of player B. In response to player A choosing up, player B can either play left or play right. Obviously, player B would choose to play left. In response to player A choosing down, player B, again, could choose left or right. Player B would choose right. Taking the perspective of player A then, in response to player B playing left, player A could choose up or down. Obviously, up is better, so she would choose up. And in response to player B choosing right, player A could choose up or down. And again, based on the payoffs, player A would choose up again. So we see that there's only one outcome that both of them would choose, and that is going to be player A up, player B left. So that is a Nash equilibrium for this game. Neither player has any incentive to deviate from this set of strategies. If player A chooses up, player B is going to choose left. If player B chooses left, player A is going to choose up. So it's the best that they can do given the nature of the game, and it is a pair of strategies that neither player has any incentive to deviate from. It is a Nash equilibrium for the game. Over here we see that right and up is a strategy that player B would choose but not A, and then right and down is a strategy that player B would choose but not B. I'm sorry, player A would choose but not B, and therefore these are not Nash equilibrium. So the Nash equilibrium strategy for player A is up, and the Nash equilibrium strategy for player B is left. So when you identify Nash equilibrium, basically you say that. You say player A up, player B left. That's how you identify the Nash equilibrium. All right, let's do some applications of these one-shot games. Of course, pricing decisions is the most relevant here. So we can see how game theory can help formalize the optimal managerial decision in a Bertrand duopoly. Again, Bertrand duopoly is a situation where the firms are competing on prices, and they could potentially undercut each other and wind up getting their prices down to marginal cost, in which case they make zero economic profit. That's this result here. Both of them choose a low price, and they wind up making zero economic profit. They could collude, work together, get behind closed doors and say, hey, you know what, let's just both charge a high price. In that case, they would both wind up here. So working together would result in this outcome where both of them would wind up getting 10 in profit each. But of course, that kind of agreement is illegal, and there is incentive to cheat on that kind of agreement. So let's say firm B was like, yeah, I'll lower my output and charge a higher price. And firm A said the same thing. But then firm B chose to charge the lower price meaning that they increase their output because they know that if they do, having agreed to both of them limit their output and raise their prices, if B cheats on them, then they could wind up doing better. So they do. They cheat on the agreement. They get 50 in profit, and then firm A winds up losing 10. Or the same thing could happen on the other end. Like firm A could, again, say, oh yeah, well, let's both charge a high price. And then firm A charges a low price, and then they win, and then firm B loses. So again, that's the Bertrand pricing game. That's the outcome that you can get in a Bertrand situation. These firms are in what's called a prisoner's dilemma, essentially, which is what I'll talk about a bit more in a second. So the payoffs here are arbitrary. They don't really mean anything in and of themselves, but their relative magnitude is consistent with the nature of Bertrand competition, as I just highlighted. The game is a one-shot simultaneous move game. In a one-shot play of the game, the Nash equilibrium strategies are for each firm to charge a low price. So let's identify that again by taking the perspective of each player and figuring out what they would do in response to their opponent's strategies. So firm A, in response to firm B charging a low price, what would they do? They would charge a low price, right? Because 0 is better than negative 10. In response to firm B charging a high price, what would firm A do? Low price again. All right, so no matter what firm B does, firm A would choose low price. Therefore, firm A has what kind of strategy? A dominant strategy. Firm A has a dominant strategy to charge a low price. All right, let's take the perspective of firm B. In response to firm A charging a low price, what would firm B do? Low price, right? Because 0 is better than negative 10. You see that? In response to firm A charging a high price, what would firm B do? Low price again, because 50 is better than 10. So regardless of what firm A does, firm B would choose a low price. So they have a dominant strategy as well to charge a low price. The two places that the strategies that both would choose intersect is low price, and therefore that is the Nash equilibrium for this game. All right, so we've identified that both have dominant strategies in this particular type of pricing game, which is a Bertrand pricing game, and there's a Nash equilibrium for both firms to charge low prices. So both firms charge low prices. The outcome of the game is that both firms earn 0 economic profits. The profits are less than the firms would earn if they colluded and agreed to both charge high prices. Again, this is a classic result in economics. It's called the dilemma, the prisoner's dilemma, because the Nash equilibrium outcome is inferior from the point of view of the firms to the situation where they both agree to charge high prices. So again, this is parallel to that situation that you learned about in your introductory economics course. That was the story of the prisoner's dilemma, where you have two bank robbers, criminals, let's say, and they agreed before they robbed the train that they if they get caught, they're not gonna rat each other out. They're not gonna say, oh well, it was this person's plan and blah blah blah. And so they do get caught. So they get caught. And now they're in prison and they get put in separate cells, and then the DA comes in and says to the one, if you tell us, your whole plan and reveal that, and give us all the evidence we need to convict, we'll let you off with a very small amount of time, and then your partner will get, the book thrown at them essentially. Both of them are told that, right? So essentially, it's like the firms being in this type of pricing game. So if you think of the firms as being the prisoners, and this being them ratting each other out, or them working together. Working together is ratting each other out. So if they each charge a high price, and essentially, I'm getting it mixed up. All right. So they are if they charge a high price, that's them working together. And them working together is them deciding to not rat each other out. So They could not rat each other out, and both of them would wind up with a decent amount of jail time. It's not ridiculously bad. But if, let's say, this one decides to rat the other one out, and the other one doesn't rat A out, then so B is the one that winds up ratting the other one out, and A does not rat B out. So that's the same situation. If they decide to charge a lower price, and A decides to maintain the agreement, but B chooses to cheat on the agreement. So that's the same thing if like the prisoner were to rat out A and A were to remain silent. So that's what this result would be. And then the other option is for B to not rat A out, but then A to break the agreement and rat B out, and therefore A would wind up with 0 or like very little prison time, and B would wind up with a lot of prison time. But because both of them rat each other out, they both wind up in a worse situation than if they had worked together. Sorry, I screwed up the story because I'm tired, but the point is that the firms in a Bertrand pricing game are in a prisoner's dilemma, essentially. So that's where the parallel comes in. That's where the importance of that story comes in, if you remember it. We don't really talk about it explicitly in this class, but it's something that's often talked about in economics when we're talking about game theory and oligopoly. Anyway, all right, so the firms are in a prisoner's dilemma, and again, because they wind up in this Nash equilibrium, which is basically cheat against each other, which is what the prisoners both do. They both wind up ratting each other out. They wind up in a situation that's worse than if they hadn't ratted each other out, if they actually kept their word to each other and both got a little bit of jail time, which in the pricing game means that both of them actually maintain that higher price and don't cheat on each other and earn better profits than they would if they both cheat on each other and wind up in the competitive outcome where they earn 0 economic profits. All right, so as we know, collusion is illegal in the U.S. As I mentioned, there's other reasons they can't achieve the higher payoff, though. Suppose the managers did secretly meet and agree to charge high prices. So from firm A's point of view, if it were to cheat on the collusive agreement by lowering its price, it would increase its profits from 10 to 50. Thus, firm A has the incentive to induce firm B to charge a high price so it can cheat to earn higher profits. B recognizes this incentive, which precludes the agreement from being reached in the first place. So B knows that A has an incentive to cheat, which is what stops B from engaging in that kind of agreement to begin with. However, suppose the manager of firm A is honest and would never cheat on a promise to charge a high price. So the question is, what happens to firm A if the manager of firm B cheats on the collusive agreement? So if, again, firm A, if they both agree to charge the higher price and then firm B cheats on the agreement, then they wind up here, and A experiences losses. When firm A's stockholders ask the manager why they lost $10 when the rival firm earned 50, the manager won't have any way to answer. They'll basically say, well, I made a mistake. I made a mistake, and now I should go to prison. So she cannot admit that she was cheated on in a collusive agreement. For doing so, might send her to jail for having violated the law. So again, it's a complicated situation. Everything I just showed you is basically what I had already talked about earlier. So another thing you should know about my lectures is so when I first created my lectures 2 years ago, when I came here for the first time, I was creating lectures for 2 classes. And I had 0 time. So I was working day and night. And I didn't have time to think about it. So all I could do was basically copy and paste the book to my slides. And then I animated the tables and I animated the graphs and whatnot. And so every semester when I present them, I try to spend some time editing them down. It's kind of like a block of clay. You kind of you have the block of clay and then you pick out pieces and eventually you've got your work of art. And so I try to do that, but I only have so much time, and these things are so long. So sometimes you'll get a bunch of things on my slides that I don't want on my slides, like a bunch of text like you just saw. And it's just because of that. But in the end, it does ultimately explain everything in one way or another. Either I explained it or the book explained it. And that's all that matters in the end. But anyway, so you have to forgive the the overabundance of text on some of my slides sometimes. I just don't have time to edit them as much as I want to. All right. All right, another application, advertising and quality decisions. So our framework for analyzing simultaneous move one-shot games can also be used to analyze advertising and quality decisions. In oligopolistic markets, firms advertise and or increase their product quality in an attempt to increase the demand for their products. While both quality and advertising can be used to increase the demand for a product, the discussion will use advertising as a placeholder for both quality and advertising. So an important issue in evaluating the consequences of advertising is to recognize where an increase in demand comes from, like what is responsible for an increase in demand. In most oligopolistic markets, advertising increases the demand for a firm's product by taking customers away from rivals. An increase in one firm's advertising increases its profits at the expense of other firms in the market. That's generally how it works. A classic example of such a situation is the breakfast cereal industry, which is highly concentrated. So you have a lot of, we have a small amount of really large firms that have a lot of market share in the cereal industry. Even though there's 1,000 different cereals in the cereal aisle, they're all basically being produced by a few firms, maybe 3 or 4. By advertising their brand of cereal, a particular firm does not induce new people to buy cereal. Instead, they just, are able to have customers switch their brand of cereal. So this can lead to a situation where each firm advertises just to cancel out the effect of the other firm's advertising, resulting in high levels of advertising, no change in industry or firm demand, and low profits. So let's see how we can demonstrate that situation in a game. So suppose your firm competes against another firm for customers. You and your rival know your products will be obsolete at the end of the year and must simultaneously determine whether or not to advertise. If in your industry, advertising does not increase total industry demand, but instead induces consumers to switch amongst the products of different firms. So if both you and your rival advertise, the two advertising campaigns will simply offset each other and you will each earn $4 million in profits. If neither of you advertises, you will earn $10 million in profits. However, if one of you advertises and the other one does not, the firm that advertises will earn $20 million because they'll steal the customers from the other brand, and the firm that does not advertise will earn $1 million in profits. So the question is your profit maximizing choice to advertise or not to advertise? And how much money do you expect to earn? And so the best way to analyze that is with a normal form representation of the game. Again, firm A can either advertise or not advertise. Firm B, the same. If they both advertise, they both wind up making the same amount of money. If neither of them advertise, they actually wind up making more money because they save money on advertising. They don't have to spend money on advertising. If firm B advertises and firm A does not advertise, firm B gets most of firm A's customers, leaving firm A with very little profit. And the game is symmetric, so the same is the case if firm A advertises and firm B does not advertise. So the question is your profit maximizing choice to advertise or not to advertise? So we need to figure out what you would choose in response to your rival's choices. So firm A, taking the perspective of firm A in response to firm B advertising, what should firm A do? Advertise, right? 4 million is better than 1 million. In response to firm B not advertising, what should firm A do? Advertise as well, because again, 20 million is better than 10 million. So regardless of what firm B does, firm A is going to advertise. That means firm A has what kind of strategy? Dominant strategy, a dominant strategy to advertise. Taking the perspective of firm B, we're going to identify the exact same thing because again, they have symmetric payoffs and they're basically in the same situation. So firm B will also have the dominant strategy to advertise. Quickly identifying that if firm A were to advertise, firm B would of course choose to advertise because 4 million is better than 1 million. And then in response to firm A not advertising, firm B would of course choose to advertise because 20 million is better than 10 million. So firm B again has a dominant strategy to advertise, and both of them have that dominant strategy to advertise, and therefore advertise is what? Is known as what? It's known as the Nash equilibrium in the game. It is the set of strategies in which neither player has any incentive to deviate from those strategies. Both of them will choose not to advertise in response to their rivals choosing. Will choose to advertise in response to their rivals choosing to advertise as well. So since both players have a dominant strategy to advertise, where these dominant strategies overlap is the Nash equilibrium for the game. The profit maximizing choice by your firm is therefore to advertise. So how much money do you expect to earn? Well, it's going to be 4 million, right? That's going to be the Nash equilibrium for the game. That is the likely outcome for this situation. In this case, both firms could agree to not advertise together, but collusion would not work because this is a one-shot game. If you or your rival agreed not to advertise in the hopes of making that $10 million each one of you would have an incentive to cheat on that and to advertise, because obviously whoever cheats and does advertise would wind up making 20 million, twice as much as if both of them did not advertise. All right, another application is coordination decisions. So a situation where the firms have different strategies and they're trying to sort of coordinate the best strategy overall for the market that they operate in. So thus far, our analysis of oligopoly has focused on situations where firms have competing objectives. One firm can gain only at the expense of other firms. Not all games have this structure, though. Imagine a world where producers of electrical appliances have a choice of which type of electrical outlets to put on appliances, either a 90-volt 4-pronged outlet or 120-volt 2-pronged outlet. In an environment where different appliances require different outlets, a consumer who desires several appliances would have to spend a considerable sum wiring the house to accommodate all appliances. This would reduce the amount the consumer has available for buying appliances and therefore would adversely affect the profits of appliance manufacturers. In contrast, if the appliance manufacturers can coordinate their decisions, that is, produce the appliances that require the same type of wiring, they will earn higher profits. So again, we could set up this coordination game as a normal form game, a one-shot normal form game, in which each one can either choose to have the 120-volt outlet or the 90-volt outlet. If they both choose the same outlets, then that's going to generate the highest payoffs. But if they choose different ones, they're going to get low payoffs because, again, people are going to be turned off by the market overall. So this kind of coordination game results in most industries where there's like innovations, where things are popping up for the first time. I mean, even if you go back to when we first introduced electricity and then started distributing electricity to households, there was the whole concept of like, well, how many of the volt prongs should we use for our outlets? Like that was something that had to be coordinated. And you see it even in like recent things where like let's say there's a new digital technology and you'll see like new technologies be introduced to deliver the content, right? Like when DVDs or when Blu-rays were introduced, they also had like the I think it was digital HD, or it was another type of disc, right? And I forget what it was called, HD DVD, I think they were called. And so they were both introduced at the same time. They had players for both of them at the same time, and then ultimately consumers chose Blu-rays. That was the ones that people wanted, and so those are the ones that remained. But they could have coordinated better, and then they wouldn't have had that kind of loss, So they could have set the game up in this way. Anyway, this type of game can be applied to a lot of situations, ultimately. So the table presents a hypothetical example of what is called a coordination game. Two firms must decide whether to produce appliances requiring 120 volts or 90 volt outlets. If each firm produces appliances requiring 120 volt outlets, each firm will produce profits of 100. Similarly, if each firm produces appliances requiring 90 volts, each firm will earn $100. However, if the two firms produce appliances requiring different types of outlets, each firm will earn zero profits due to the lower demand that will result from consumers' need to spend more money wiring their houses. So what would you do if you were the manager of firm A in this example? So that's the question to consider. If you don't know what firm B is going to do, you have a very tough decision. So all you can do is guess what firm B will do. If you think B will choose 120 volt outlets, then obviously your best choice is 120 volt outlets as well. But if you think that firm B will choose 90 volt outlets, then obviously 90 volt outlets is the one that you should choose. So you'll thus maximize profits by doing what firm B does, but again, you don't know what firm B does. So effectively, both you and B will do better by coordinating your decisions. So in this situation, the game has two Nash equilibria. So the question is how the firm will get to one of these equilibria. If the firms could talk to each other, they could agree to produce the 120 volt outlets. Alternatively, the government could set a standard that electrical outlets be required to operate on 120 volt two-pronged outlets, which I think is what happened ultimately when this problem was kind of playing itself out in our society. The government is the one that stepped in and said we should just use the 120 volt outlet. In effect, this would allow the firms to coordinate their decisions by having an arbiter basically come in and solve the problem for them. So notice that once they agree to produce 120 volt appliances, there's no incentive to cheat on this agreement. So that is a Nash equilibrium. There's no incentive to deviate from that set of strategies. But like I mentioned earlier, games can have multiple Nash equilibria. This one does. And so again, it creates some certainty. Well, these are the two likely outcomes. But again, because there are two likely outcomes where both players would stand to benefit and have no incentive to deviate from those strategies, if they chose those strategies, then we really don't know which outcome will actually happen in the game. But we can narrow it down, and that's where the game theory and the Nash equilibria concept sort of helps the situation. The game is not analogous to the pricing or advertising games analyzed earlier. It's a game of coordination rather than a game of conflicting interests. All right, let's think about another situation, monitoring employees. So game theory can also be used to analyze interactions between workers and the managers. In Chapter 6, we discussed the principal-agent problem and argue that there can be conflicting goals between workers and managers. Managers desire workers to work hard while workers enjoy leisure. In our discussion of the manager-worker principal-agent problem in Chapter 6, we noted that one way a manager can reduce workers' incentives to shirk, to avoid the responsibility, is to engage in random spot checks of the workplace, to set up like just a random schedule of checking in on workers so that workers can't know when the managers are going to come in, and therefore they will be afraid not to work, essentially. Game theory provides a way of seeing why this can work. So consider a game between a worker and a manager. The manager has two possible actions: monitor the worker or don't monitor the worker. The worker has two choices: work or shirk. So managers player 1, workers player 2. Again, manager can monitor or not monitor. Worker can either work or shirk. If the manager monitors while the worker works, then the worker wins and the manager loses. So this is the manager so the manager monitors and the worker works. So the manager has to put in extra time to monitor the worker, and that's where that -1 comes from. That's where the loss comes from. It comes from a loss of time. Time has an opportunity cost. So the manager has spent time monitoring the worker who is already working. The payoffs are the same if the manager does not monitor the worker and the worker shirks. So again, the manager does not monitor, the worker shirks, the worker wins, the manager loses because the worker is not doing anything and there's no productivity there. In contrast, if the manager monitors the worker while the worker shirks, the manager wins 1 and the worker gets caught, loses 1. So again, manager monitors and it was worth their time because they caught their worker shirking and now they can get rid of them or whatever and hire a better worker. Similarly, if the worker works and the manager does not monitor, the manager wins 1 and the worker loses 1. So that's essentially this situation here where the manager doesn't have to engage in a spot check and the worker loses because they didn't get to slack off. So the numbers are purely hypothetical, but they're consistent with the relative payoffs that exist in such situations. So notice that the game does not have a Nash equilibrium, at least not in the usual sense of the term. So again, to identify that, in response to the worker choosing to work, the manager could either monitor or not monitor, and obviously they would choose to not monitor. In response to the worker shirking, the manager can either monitor or not monitor, and obviously they would choose to monitor. So the manager does not have a dominant strategy. And then taking the perspective of the worker, in response to the manager monitoring, the worker can either work or shirk, and obviously they would choose to, in this case, work. In response to the manager not monitoring, the worker can either work or shirk, and of course they would choose to shirk because 1 is better than -1. So we can see that there's no set of strategies that overlap. There's no set of strategies in which both players have no incentive to deviate. Each one has an incentive to deviate. If the manager chooses to monitor, the worker will choose to shirk. If the worker chooses to shirk, the manager will choose to monitor. I'm sorry. If the worker chooses to shirk, yes, the manager will choose to monitor. But again, if the manager chooses to monitor, then the worker is going to choose to work. So anyway, there's no set of strategies that will land us in some obvious result here. It's circular as far as the dynamic decision making. It just kind of goes round and round. So the thing to notice in this example is that both the worker and the manager want to keep their actions secret. If the manager knows what the worker is doing, it will be curtains for the worker and vice versa. So in such situations, players find it in their interest to engage in what's called a mixed or randomized strategy. What this means is that players randomize over their available strategies. So they basically don't have any set plan. They just kind of randomly do things. So for instance, the manager flips a coin to determine whether or not to monitor. By doing so, the worker cannot predict whether the manager will be present to monitor her and consequently cannot outguess the worker. Anyway, that's something that this sort of approach can help us to identify. It's not very complicated, but it just shows the flexibility of the approach, and you can use it in many different applications, but it gets definitely more complicated than what we see here, but that's what this is about. It's about just kind of highlighting the fact that, hey, you can explain these other things with this approach. And I think this might be the last one, Nash bargaining. So the final application of simultaneous move one-shot games we'll consider as a simple bargaining game. In a Nash bargaining game, 2 players bargain over some object of value. In a simultaneous move one-shot bargaining game, the players have only one chance to reach an agreement, and the offers made in bargains are made at the same time. So again, it's a simultaneous move one-shot game. So suppose that management and a labor union are bargaining over how much of a $100 surplus to give the union. So we have management here and the union here. This one's a little bit more complicated. Each one has 3 different strategies versus 2 different strategies. Suppose for simplicity that the $100 can be split only into $50 increments. So it's either going to be $100, $50, or $0. The players have one shot to reach an agreement. The parties simultaneously write the amount that they desire on a piece of paper, either 0, 50, or 100. So again, they have $100. They're trying to figure out how they're going to split it between the management and the union. If the sum of the amounts each party asks for does not exceed $100, then the players get the specified amount. But if the sum of the amounts requested exceed $100, bargaining ends in a stalemate. So suppose that the delays caused by this stalemate cause both the union and management $1. So again, that's situations where both of them write down how much they would like, and it exceeds the $100 threshold, but they lose time in coming up with it. So that's where the -1 comes from. So the table represents the normal form of this hypothetical bargaining game. Suppose management writes down 100. So management writes down 100. Then the only way she would get any money is if the union were to ask for 0. Because again, if the union asks for 50, that takes you over the $100, which means they both lose. And if the union writes 100, same thing. Notice that if management asks for $100 and the union asks for 0, neither party would have any incentive to change its amounts. We would be at a Nash equilibrium. So again, so if the union chose 0, management obviously would want to choose 100 there. And if the union chose 50, then management would want to choose the 50 because that's the highest payoff there. And if the union chose 100, then management would want to choose obviously 0. And then taking the perspective of the union, in response to the union choosing 0, what would the in response to the management choosing 0, what would the union choose? 100, right? Because 100 is the highest payoff there. And in response to management choosing 50, what would the union choose? 50. And in response to management choosing 100, what would the union choose? 0, right? So as you can see, there are 3 Nash equilibria for this bargaining game. Again, like, we weren't able to say exactly what the outcome of this bargaining game is, but we were able to narrow it down to the 3 possible outcomes. And so again, that's where the usefulness of the Nash equilibria would be. So this example illustrates that the outcome of simultaneous move bargaining games are difficult to predict because there are generally multiple Nash equilibria. This multiplicity of equilibria leads to inefficiencies when the parties fail to coordinate on an equilibrium. In this example, for instance, 6 of the 9 potential outcomes are inefficient in that they result in total payoffs that are less than the amount that could be divided. All right, well, that's basically it. So the takeaway from this whole thing is just kind of to understand the game theory approach and then how it can be applied to the oligopoly setting. And we also kind of obviously highlighted the flexibility of the approach. But as we move forward, when we look at repeated games and then we look at sequential games, then the sort of results that we'll get from that will help us to understand how firms can get out of the Bertrand prisoner's dilemma and maybe do a little bit better in those type of situations. Anyway, let's cut the class early. That's why I wanted to get a short break in, because I knew we could end it kind of early today. So let's do that, because I am exhausted and I have to go grade an exam now. So I wish all of you the best. I hope you have a great 2 weeks, because we're not meeting next week. And that's it. So I'll see you in a couple of weeks. Have a good couple of weeks. Make sure you guys work hard, okay? Work really hard. Okay. Bye-bye.